Having been exposed to numerous unsettling tales, I have come to realize the extent of human depravity. It's a perplexing aspect of our existence, leaving me struggling to comprehend the motivations behind such behavior. Today, I feel compelled to share a personal encounter that has left me utterly bewildered. I cannot begin to fathom the motives of the person involved. During my formative years, I resided in a remote rural area. My family faced financial hardships, necessitating long walks whenever I wanted to spend time with school friends. Our infrequent use of gasoline for non-essential trips meant that traversing country gravel roads became a familiar routine. At the age of 13, I had a deeply unsettling experience. My friend Daniel received a futuristic gaming console called the Stellar Game System for his birthday, circa 1990. In contrast, my family only owned an antiquated Sega Genesis, limiting my exposure to video games. Consequently, I spent much of that summer at Daniel's house, immersed in the enchanting world of video gaming. On a particular day, I spent the entire day and evening engrossed in games like Cryptica, Galactic Fighters, and Sonic the Wanderer. Before I knew it, midnight had stealthily crept upon us. Ordinarily, I would have opted to spend the night at Daniel's house, a practice I had grown accustomed to. However, I had to be home in the morning, as attending church was considered essential by my parents. They were unable to pick me up from Daniel's, leaving me with no choice but to undertake the long walk home. This journey encompassed several miles, often taking approximately 2 hours to complete. The path consisted predominantly of gravel roads enveloped by dense woods, illuminated solely by the moon's feeble glow. Setting out on the paved road leading to Daniel's house, I encountered a small convenience store where I made the turn onto the gravel road homeward. It surprised me to spot an individual on the store's porch, as it had remained closed for quite some time, and I had never witnessed any activity there before. Perhaps I inadvertently gazed at the person for a tad too long. A social fox paused, some consider impolite. In response, the person reciprocated the stare, yet the darkness shrouded their facial expressions, rendering them indiscernible. Sensing my unintentional rudeness, the person eventually rose, prompting me to avert my gaze. Continuing my walk, I made a conscious effort to avoid further glances at the individual. However, I must admit that I surreptitiously monitored their movements from the corner of my eye. The person gradually approached the side of the store, their gaze fixed upon me as I proceeded along the gravel road. They eventually stepped onto the gravel itself, marking the last time I stole a glance in their direction. From then on, I focused solely on walking until the store was out of sight. Regrettably, being away from the person near the store offered only limited solace. I now found myself walking down the dark expanse of a gravel country road. The dense trees cast long, eerie shadows, and I had an arduous journey ahead with no source of illumination. Gradually, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, allowing me to perceive my path and the surrounding trees to some extent. Nevertheless, the sight was far from ideal, and I occasionally caught glimpses of imaginary figures lurking within the shadows. Thoughts of murderers concealed within the impenetrable darkness and protected by the trees haunted my every step. Of course, it was foolish of me to allow my mind to dwell on such thoughts. However, in situations like these, the human brain tends to fixate on fear. I did my best to dismiss those distressing musings and attempted to divert my attention elsewhere. While struggling to conjure amusing or less alarming thoughts, I heard a distinct crunching sound behind me, reminiscent of footsteps on the gravel. I halted, my senses straining to discern any signs of movement amidst the darkness. Receiving no response to my inquiry, I couldn't help but recall the disconcerting individual from the convenience store. Intensifying my fear, I fought against dwelling on those thoughts, opting instead to listen intently to the crunching sound. After a brief pause, the crunching ceased, rather than providing solace. This sudden cessation only added to the eerie ambience, making no logical sense. I waited for the sound to return, but it never did. Resuming my journey, I turned and continued walking home. The passage of time eluded me, yet silence persisted for a while. Amidst the cacophony of crickets and the symphony of nocturnal creatures, another sound emerged. This time, it originated from the right side of the road, emanating from the depths of the forest. It resembled the distinct footsteps of a person traversing through the woods. I hoped it might be a deer or some other harmless creature, but the cadence differed. Having grown up in the remote countryside, I could discern the discrepancy between the footsteps of a person and those of a deer. I knew someone was trailing me, albeit maintaining a considerable distance. My initial instinct was to feign ignorance, as if I hadn't heard a thing. In my mind, acknowledging the previous incident would betray my knowledge of being followed, potentially causing the pursuer to retreat into the woods. Thus, I kept walking, hyper-aware of the sounds of someone concealed amidst the trees, growing increasingly nervous as the footsteps drew closer. Briefly halting, I knelt down, swiftly collecting a handful of gravel from the road and placing it in my pocket. I repeated the action, clasping a second handful firmly in my hand. As I rose to my feet, the night fell into silence, devoid of anything but the usual nocturnal harmonies. It occurred to me that my momentary pause might have alerted the pursuer, causing them to halt as well. Uncertain of my next move, I stood pondering whether to continue walking or remain stationary. The decision eluded me. Just as I was about to take a step forward, a voice emanated from the woods. "I know you saw me by the store," it declared, deliberately distorting its tone to instill fear. "Leave me alone," I replied, my voice trembling with fear, unaware of the mistake I had made. "Now, I know exactly where you are," the voice chuckled, evoking a sense of menace. Subsequently, the woods emitted a flurry of noise as the person advanced toward me. Reacting swiftly, I hurled the handful of gravel in the direction of the noise, repeating the action twice more. With each throw, I heard yelps of pain. Finally, I flung two more handfuls, causing a commotion. Seizing the opportunity, I turned and sprinted. However, I veered away from the gravel road, darting into the dense foliage on the left, where I soon found a secluded hiding spot. Taking advantage of a towering oak tree, I climbed swiftly, concealing myself among the branches. Overwhelmed by fear, I realized I had to remain as still as possible. Neither of us had a flashlight, and the darkness still enveloped the surroundings. I hoped the barrage of gravel had inflicted enough pain to muffle any sound that might give away my direction. After a while, I heard rustling among the trees. However, it eventually subsided. Once the noise ceased, it was gone for good. Though I couldn't ascertain the exact passage of time, I deduced that enough had elapsed for the pursuer to depart. Silently descending from the oak tree, I opted to walk along the edge of the road instead of its center, ensuring my footsteps were muffled. Every sound in my vicinity commanded my attention as I advanced cautiously, bracing for any sign of movement from the woods or the road. Thankfully, the dreaded noises never materialized. I continued walking until I finally arrived home. Our house was situated at the end of a long driveway, and while my instinct urged me to dash hurriedly to safety, I suppressed it. Instead, I approached quietly. Everyone in the house slumbered peacefully as I slipped inside, tiptoeing to my bed. Falling asleep took an eternity, the harrowing experience still fresh in my mind. The following morning, I mustered the courage to recount the events to my father. In response, he handed me one of his hunting knives, advising me to carry it and instructing me to defend myself if such a situation were to recur. That was simply his nature. If the intruder had approached our house, he would have confronted them with a shotgun, ready to protect his family. Never before had I encountered the mysterious individual. I shared my observations with the store owner, who was aware of a recent robbery, but my account failed to provide any substantial assistance. Given my limited glimpse of the person, I cannot definitively state whether I ever encountered them again. If I did, I would have remained oblivious to their presence. I have an incredibly unconventional extended family. My Aunt Susan has gone through numerous partners in her life, but the only one who stuck around for an extended period was a man named Mark. He was a bit of a troublemaker, always involved in shady dealings and getting by on illicit activities with his circle of friends. Money was never abundant, just enough to get by. It seemed like his family was always on the move, constantly searching for a new place to settle. During one of my visits, the most bizarre and chilling incident of my life unfolded. Mark was in the process of constructing a house in an area bordering a vast forest. Many others were building houses in the vicinity, and while Mark's family resided in their unfinished abode, the living room overlooked the forest. Curiously, the couch was positioned beneath a window lacking glass, making it an eerie spot to sit, particularly at night. I stayed there for 3 nights. On the first evening, Mark made an attempt to scare me. We were watching horror movies on the couch, and he excused himself, claiming he was heading next door to grab some beer. However, His true intention was to sneak around to the window facing the forest and startle me by jumping through it. His plan, however, fell flat for several reasons. Firstly, leaving the room to spook someone was my usual strategy, so I always anticipated such tricks. Moreover, sitting beneath a gaping hole in the wall facing a dense forest, I could easily predict what was about to happen. So when Mark grabbed me through the window, my response was a nonchalant, "Hey, Mark." Disappointed but unsurprised, he realized that attempting to scare someone deeply immersed in horror and the macabre was an exercise in futility. I did inform Mark that my mother would be coming over the following day to spend one last night. Before moving on, I suggested he try to frighten her since she had only recently begun watching scary movies after her divorce from my father, and they were not her preferred genre. This set the stage for the events that unfolded on the subsequent night in 1991. We had everything meticulously arranged. My mother would be sitting under the window, and we knew she would be genuinely scared since horror movies were never her cup of tea. As Mark prepared himself, he excused his departure, stating that he needed to borrow cigarettes from a house nearby. He rose and left, circling the house before disappearing into the woods. His plan was to create some eerie noises in the forest, capturing my mother's attention, and then, when she was engrossed in the movie again, sneak up and startle her. The first part of the prank went off without a hitch. We all heard noises emanating from the woods beyond the window, but everyone except my mother dismissed it. We assured her it was probably just the wind, attributing her unease to the movie's suspense, so we urged her to refocus on the film. As we became engrossed in the movie once again, we waited eagerly for Mark's grand scare. We waited some more, but he never made a move. At first, we assumed Mark was attempting to unnerve all of us, aiming for the last laugh by scaring the entire group. We kept waiting throughout the duration of the first film. Then we started the second one, still anticipating Mark's long-awaited appearance. But he never showed up. My Aunt Susan excused herself, claiming she would check on Mark in the neighboring house. I watched her disappear into the woods, well aware that she was venturing out to uncover the reason for Mark's prolonged absence. Eventually, she returned to the house, clearly distressed, and explained the situation to my mother. It was a revelation that left us all alarmed. The older members of our family ventured outside to search for Mark, but our efforts were in vain. He was nowhere to be found, and I never saw him again, given his involvement in illicit activities. It wasn't entirely surprising that something untoward may have occurred. It's possible that he crossed paths with dangerous individuals or encountered trouble. The noises we heard in the woods might not have been part of Mark's scare attempt, but rather a genuine struggle that resulted in my quasi-uncle vanishing forever. I had an incredibly frightening camping experience once. I decided to camp in a secluded area of a public park as there weren't many people around. Although I adore the woods, I've always had a slight fear of venturing deep into them, mainly due to concerns about getting lost. So, being in a public park provided a comforting sense of security. One afternoon, I drove to the local grocery store to gather some supplies. On my way back, I passed by a nearby bar and thought it might be nice to stop for a drink. I had been alone for nearly a week at that point, and although I didn't know anyone at the bar, I thought it would be pleasant to be around people for a while. I spent some time at the bar, observing the patrons and enjoying a light drink. I found myself watching a game of pool, without even realizing that I may have been staring too intently. It seems one of the players grew irritated by my gaze. The individual wasn't particularly large, perhaps even smaller than me. However, he approached me at the bar with an attempt to intimidate. "You got a problem with staring, man?" he asked, ordering a drink from the bartender. Glancing at my beverage, an amaretto stone sour, he remarked, "I guess you're a bit of a pansy drinking something like that and staring at me." I assured him that I was merely observing the game of pool and offered to stop if it bothered him. However, he persisted in provoking me. Irritation started to build within me, and I eventually lost my composure. He pushed my shoulder, and in response, I pushed him off, causing him to topple over a bar stool. Enraged, he quickly regained his footing and forcefully pushed me. He attempted to grab me, but the bouncer had already intervened, promptly escorting him out of the bar. While the bouncer didn't lay hands on me, he also informed me that I had to leave. We both found ourselves in the parking lot as I got into my car to depart. The troublemaker hopped into his own vehicle and followed me for a while. However, when I turned into the camping site, he continued driving past. I genuinely believed that would be the end of the ordeal. The incident slipped my mind for the remainder of the day and evening. By the time I settled down in my tent, I felt at ease once more and drifted off to sleep effortlessly. It was an odd sound that roused me from my slumber. Inside my tent, I found myself in my sleeping bag. The noise I heard was unfamiliar and eerie, but it didn't immediately trigger alarm. Curiosity prompted me to switch on my light and investigate the source. As the light flooded the tent, I glanced up and immediately spotted the silhouette of someone standing just outside. Moreover, I witnessed the tip of a knife gradually piercing through the fabric of my tent. The slow cutting motion rapidly transformed into frantic tearing once the light illuminated the scene. Instinct kicked in, and I reacted as best I could. For my protection, I had a stun gun within reach in my tent. Seizing it, I lunged toward the figure attempting to breach my tent. I pressed the trigger, and amidst the crackling sound of the stun gun and a loud cry, I heard the thud of an individual collapsing to the ground. Emerging from my tent, I wasn't the least bit surprised to discover the man from the bar lying unconscious on the ground. The stun gun had effectively incapacitated him. I hurriedly sought the assistance of camping security, and they promptly contacted the police. The next time I laid eyes on the man was when he was being led away in handcuffs.